Today is the first in a series of talks about parks and greenways and open space that Metro Parks and the Nashville Civic Design Center are partnering on. So I want to express my thanks to the Design Center for all the hard work that they've done on this series, and especially to Jolie, who is somewhere, who has done a fantastic job on pulling all of this together. Metro Parks is in the midst of developing a new countywide parks and greenways master plan. It's called Plan to Play, and if you have not heard of it yet, then it's my bad. But it is a big, monumental project, and when we got started on it, Mayor Barry said, think big. And that is sweet, sweet music to the ears of people who care about parks and greenways and open space in Nashville. That's a great directive. And in fact, this plan will be our guide for sustainable and equitable growth of our park and greenway infrastructure over the next 10 to 12 years. The part of a plan like this that always gets the most attention is the what. What parks, what greenways, what programs and facilities are going to be where. That's kind of the shiny new part of the plan. It's the big wish list. It's the fun part to come up with. And in some ways, it's the easy part. It's the 1% inspiration. Now, Plan to Play will have that. That's a hugely important part of the plan, the what part. But equally important in Plan to Play is the how. What are the tools and strategies that we're going to use to go from wish list to reality? And as all of us know about the projected increase in population in Nashville, I think a lot of people in this room are very familiar with Nashville Next and the future it lays out for us with the densification of many parts of the city. And that's going to require a bigger toolbox when it comes to parks. Our guest today is the country's foremost pioneer in innovating new tools and strategies for vibrant, thriving urban parks, the what and the how of great city park systems. He is Vice President and the Director of City Park Development for the Trust for Public Land. He's formerly the Commissioner of Parks for New York City, where he presided over an era of unprecedented innovation and growth. We're thrilled to have him here today. Please join me in welcoming Adrian Benepe.
Thank you very much, Tim. And Tim took me and Rick Wood out for a nice jaunt around just a few of the parks of this great city this morning. Let me just say, it's absolutely polite to keep eating while I talk, because we won't get through it. If you stop eating an hour from now, you'll still be hungry. So I will be insulted if you don't keep eating. I will tell you too, this is great. This is my very first day in Nashville in my life. I've always wanted to come here before, but I worked for almost all my career in New York City Parks Department or nonprofits in New York, where my idea was travel was going from the North Bronx to the South Shore of Staten Island. That was a big trip. And by the way, you could do that in the same amount of time as it took to fly from New York to here. Let me thank, I have to go through a list of thank yous if you'll bear with me. Let me thank and say how great it is to be at the Cumberland River Compact. This is a beautiful place. Thank you for hosting us. I don't think I've ever spoken in a more beautiful location than this. I've always had a great fondness for cities on rivers, and that sure doesn't beat this view. I want any landscape architects in the house today? So raise your hand if you're a landscape architect. So you probably can see from a distance I'm wearing my honorary ASLA pin. So I appreciate that. So let me thank the Tennessee ASLA. For those of you who don't know what the ASLA stands for, the American Society of Landscape Architects, the people who represent the noblest profession of them all, in my view, landscape architecture. I was well trained by landscape architects through my more than 30 years working for parks. Our partners here in Metro Parks, thank you very much for organizing this and for the work we're doing together. The Nashville Parks Foundation and Greenways for Nashville, those are just some of the partners who made today possible and some of the work we're doing. I got to meet Councilmember at Large John Cooper, who's the former roommate of our deputy mayor now in New York City. So there's always a connection someplace. I want to thank you're one of the deans of, you don't know this, but you have one of the deans of park directors in the entire country here, Tommy Lynch. He's highly regarded. He's one of the very highly regarded park directors in the entire country. So, and Tim Nate, who just showed me around this morning. I do want to acknowledge, again, another connection from this city back to New York City. Back when I was the Manhattan Parks Commissioner, before I was elevated to the Commissioner of the whole city, I had a young intern straight out of NYU working for me. And that young intern is now Christian Parrow. So Christian, will you raise a hand? Christian is doing a little bit of development here in the city. And he's very park friendly. So if you like park friendly developers, you need to know Christian Parrow. Christian was one of the smartest people we ever hired in the Parks Department. So, and how long? 15 years now since you've been down here?
11 years.
11 years, okay. So he's still only 22. He started, we don't have child labor laws in New York City, so he started when he was 5. And then you need to know Rick Wood. Rick, would you stand up? If you don't know Rick, Rick is the Tennessee Director for the Trust for Public Land. Sad to say he's not based in Nashville. He's based in Chattanooga, but don't hold that against him, because we've done some great things in Chattanooga, including the Tennessee River Walk, which is that now 15 miles now? 13 miles of riverfront and other connecting trails over the course of about 10 years, maybe? Thereabouts. It's really quite extraordinary. That was not a simple task, and he's done a great job. So we're doing a little bit of work here. Directly across the river, just up that ways a bit, is something known as Rolling Mills Hill. Some of you may know it. It's a 13-acre site, a beautiful waterfront site. And we did the land acquisition on that. That's going to become a metro park. We're working on the plan to play, as Tim mentioned. It's one of several park master plans we're working on. There's a similar thing happening in Denver and a number of other cities that we're working on. And perhaps most interesting, I'm not going to talk about it today because it would take up the entire session. We're working on something called Climate Smart Nashville. And essentially it's a way that you look at all of the components that make up a city that you can map: the geomorphic, geotechnical, the infrastructure, then the socioeconomic, the health, the demographic, and you map all of those things. You start to say, if we're going to deal with, is it okay to say climate change in this room? In some places it's not. Like I go to some states, they say, do not use the C word. Truly. But as you deal with the impacts of climate change, whether to whatever you want to attribute that, and you deal with a lot, you find that you can mitigate the impacts of climate change, whether it's riparian flooding, stormwater flooding, urban heat islands. Turns out that urban heat islands is the biggest killer of all the climate-related causes, much more than flooding. You can mitigate a lot of carbon. A lot of those can be mitigated through the creation of trails and greenways. And we create what we call a climate smart city decision support tool to help cities, particularly really fast growing cities like this, look at all of their opportunities for creating parks, green space, open space, and connective tissue that can help you mitigate the impacts of climate change. Really fun, exciting stuff. So something worth looking into. So let's get started. What we're going to do today is I'm going to talk to you about interesting park paradigms around the United States. We don't work around the world. I'm not going to talk to you about things going on in Guangzhou or Paris. There's some cool stuff happening around the world, but we're just going to talk about the United States and across a spectrum of large cities to small cities. And you're somewhere right in between. So you're going to see some much smaller cities, some obviously much larger cities. And how cities, particularly growing cities, vibrant cities, are using parks as a very important component of that quality of life. And we would argue, because we do argue this, that a really good park system is the hallmark of a great city, and you can't really have a great city without a really good park system. And we do something every year called Park Score, where we rank cities and look at some different quantifiers and qualifiers, mostly quantifiers, things that you can measure and count. It doesn't work so well for certain cities. It doesn't work perfectly for a city like Nashville because it tends to focus on walkability and dense urban cores. So it doesn't work so well for Louisville and for Indianapolis. Very livable cities, but the park score is just a little bit skewed toward the denser cities. So I would tell you that your park system is much better than your park score shows, but you do max out on median park size, and you have an extraordinary amount of parkland for a city of this population. 15,000 acres dwarf cities that are 3 or 4 or even 10 times the size in terms of the acreage. So you have this great thing of parks. So that's where you look at the context. So when we talk about the future of parks, we're going to talk about some very unconventional ways. This is no longer the 19th century where Frederick Law Olmsted can roll into town and say, we're going to take this vacant land and turn it into a park. We're talking about retrofitting parks back into the urban fabric in a lot of different ways. And we're talking about not just saying there's an unlimited public purse, but you have to look at different ways of funding both the park creation and their maintenance. And that also the old model of everything is run by and programmed by the city parks department, that's also changing, that's evolving. You still have to have a strong commitment by your mayor and your city council, your civic leaders to parks, but hybrid park partnerships are very much the model of now and of the future. The Trust for Public Land has taken on as its primary mission to, we have a very modest goal that every resident of urban America should have a park, a playground, a green space, a community garden, or greenway within a 10-minute walk. It's not just a 10-minute walk to a park, but it's a 10-minute walk to some very, very important factors that make for a livable city. And we call this the 10-minute walk benefits flower. These are the benefits that parks convey, and city leaders have started to understand that. The obvious one maybe is the environment, that you can't have a resilient or sustainable city without parks. As you look around you see all these green trees. They're busy absorbing our carbon dioxide and absorbing the particulate matter. They're reducing the urban heat island impact. You have opportunities for environmental education to the extent you have natural areas. And then public health, that probably goes without saying. We did a study with the RAND Corporation that showed that 50% of all vigorous exercise takes place in a nearby neighborhood park. And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense. If you got to play tennis, go for a run, a brisk walk, play basketball, it's a lot better if you don't have to drive to that. So the extent you can get exercise. And then these, the parks functioning as green infrastructure, they're filtering your stormwater runoff, keeping it out of your storm sewers or your sewage treatment plants, or reducing the ambient temperature and improving the air and water quality. So they're providing what we call, the geeks among us call ecosystem services. Parks are providing natural ecosystem services, and you can even engineer green infrastructure, as was done directly across the river by Hawkins Partners with that beautiful new park. Economic investment. Study after study shows that parks raise property values. What do raised property values do? They give you higher taxes, which allow you to pay for more city services. At minimum, generally speaking, across the board, 15% increment in the real estate value next to a park. Does that make sense to you, Christian? Yep. He's a plant. So again, many people are now looking at when they're doing the development saying, where's the park at the center of this development? And by the way, if we're going to be adding tens of thousands of new units someplace in our downtown, there better be some parks near there. Because if you don't do that, when those new residents start to have children, they'll say, okay, where's our Little League field? And we don't want to have to drive to the suburbs to find that field. So that's why you have to start to figure out how you're going to crank this stuff in. Community, really good cohesive communities often have parks at the center of them. Sometimes the parks are the focal points. They're often the places where community groups develop. You first get your start maybe being a part of a Friends of Parks group, and then you run for city council. We're very interested in the whole idea of creative placemaking, that is arts as part of a park. And as I go around, just look at this, you can see this terrific sculpture. I think this sculptor has a sculpture on the Manhattan waterfront too. Alice Aycock, that's the way I thought. It's an Alice Aycock, thank you. That public art is a very important part of doing good public spaces and engaging the public as you do it. And then finally, the thing that I like to talk about a lot, which we call it inspiration. I had to settle for that word because I call it beauty. So we snuck the word beauty in there. There's really no point in doing a park in open space unless it's beautiful, unless it provides respite and has flowers and attracts butterflies and has artwork in it and stuff. And particularly for underserved populations who don't have the ability to drive outside of the city, get to the national parks, you need to have that beauty in the inner city and to have that connection to nature and to have the arts and culture park. So this is when you start to say, when somebody says, but we don't have money to put into parks, you say, well, do you have money to improve the tax base, and do you have money to capture the stormwater and all those other things? You start to see how vital parks are and how the case can be made that you have to have all these benefits through parks. And parks are very important parts of healthy communities. This happens to be, I love these two pictures. These happen, every once in a while I'll do a plug for the Trust for Public Land. This is a small little, tiny little park in Denver. It's called New Freedom Park, and it happens to be in a neighborhood where 3 completely different political refugee immigrant groups have settled from three different continents, and they're mixed together in this one park. As it turns out, there's a few common languages. One of those common languages is football. The other common language is growing vegetables, so we have a community garden. The other common language is the common language of children speak, playing with each other in a little playground. And then this is a tiny little unincorporated city in LA County. This is probably about a quarter of an acre empty lot that we turned into a playground. And we commissioned an artist, talking about creative placemaking, to do a giant 3-headed Mayan serpent play sculpture with mosaics on top of it. He's a guy who's done some work for Disney, you can almost tell. Because the neighborhood residents with whom we did the community engagement said, we don't want this regular play sculpture, we want something that speaks to our community. This was a lot of fun to do. And then this is just one of my, Mary Miss, an artist, designed with some landscape architects this bottom end of Battery Park City Park. It's called the Battery Cove. To this day, I think the loveliest, most romantic little landscape ever created in New York City. Nobody goes there. You can go there and feel all on your own. Just go there on a summer evening sometime. And that's the collaboration of an artist working on a very mega real estate development, but creating a very, very special place. We're going to talk a lot about the concept of adaptive reuse. This is the Brooklyn waterfront about 20 years ago. That's the Brooklyn Bridge. And this is a former Port Authority terminals, piers and wharfs and warehouses. And they no longer needed, the shipping had moved away to deep water ports, and this was redundant property. And just up above here and around the corner there, actually there's the Brooklyn Bridge and the Manhattan Bridge, were some really nice neighborhoods, but with no parks. And so these were going to be turned into condos, and the neighborhood said, wait a second, A, we don't want you to block our views, but B, we need some parks. So extraordinarily, here as you can see kind of what was left over there. Extraordinarily, the political leaders, the then governor and mayor of New York, Mayor Giuliani and Mayor Pataki, said, okay, we'll do that. We'll forego the revenue in this site. Not only will we forego the revenue, we're going to invest $400 million in city and state capital funds to build a new park, which they did. Now you have Brooklyn Bridge Park. It's a 1.5 mile long park along the waterfront of Brooklyn. This is a big gathering space where they have movies, and this is a 2-year-old landscape designed by Michael Van Valkenburg. And for all the world, it looks like a naturalistic landscape on the edge of the river, built on landfill, on former piers. Some of the piers have been converted into basketball courts and soccer fields because space is at such a premium. Here's another great adaptive reuse. An old gas tank farm right at the edge of downtown Seattle. So there's the Seattle waterfront here. This old gas tank farm has been converted into Olympic Sculpture Park. So there's a small art museum full of sculptures, a lot of great outdoor sculptures here. There might even be a Alice Aycock in there. Looks like a Mark de Suvro there. Very complex spot. They had to come across a road, then across a railroad track and connect in with the Seattle. This was one of the most complicated landscape architecture and engineering projects I've ever seen. But there again, squeezing into a former industrial brownfield, a new waterfront park again, I'll have to say, take credits. The Trust for Public Land was one of the prime actors in that. And now they're looking to do sort of part two on a much grander scale to convert the entire waterfront in Seattle into a park and boulevard. And they're taking down this elevated freeway and putting it underground. It's a $1 billion project to revive that waterfront. Anybody been to the High Line? Raise a hand if you have. That's pretty good. It's pretty remarkable. This is a tiny little park in New York. It's 7 acres. It's a former elevated freight rail line where they used to haul mostly food products in and out of lower Manhattan when we had a vital manufacturing base down there. There was a Nabisco company, a bunch of things in lower Manhattan, and then that went away. Here you can see all these former industrial buildings with the freight trains running right through them. And they put them up, a guy named Robert Moses, anybody know that name? He was, one of his early projects was to take the freight trains off the streets where they're at grade on Death Avenue and move them onto this giant structure running right into the warehouses in lower Manhattan. It became derelict and it was about to be torn down because the adjacent property owner said, this albatross is killing our property values. And the neighborhood had another idea and said, we've got to save this structure. And by the way, we have no parks. What about an elevated park in the sky? And they came to me with it. I said, that's the craziest idea I've ever heard. They came to the then candidate running for mayor, Mike Bloomberg. He said, I love it. I said, I love it. You'd appreciate that. 10 years and $240 million later, you have the High Line. Now that sounds like a lot of money, right? It is. It's a lot of money. Even by New York standards, that's a whole boatload of money. 160 million of that's public dollars. 140 is city capital dollars, and 20 million is, we got some, in the days when you used to be able to get pork, we got some pork. $20 million in federal rails to trails money that went into this. And yes, it's the $30 million per acre. But what happened after that was, along with some rezoning, to allow adjacent property owners to add some bulk and height and move the buildings away from the High Line. 40 new buildings, between $2 and $4 billion in new investments, and already an amortization of that city money spent in net new taxes. Now, past performances are no indicator of future. This doesn't work everywhere, but this is the kind of thing that can work, and as I look around Nashville, I see things like that could happen here because you have such a boom going on. This is another concept, multifunctional infrastructure. This is Miami. Miami has great weather all year round. It's a little hot in the summer. Perfect place to bicycle. But I wouldn't get on a bicycle on a bet in Miami because it's so dangerous. The streets are so busy. And yet there is this elevated transit corridor for commuter rail running right 10 miles right through Miami, with sort of scrabbly green grass underneath. I was in Miami about 4 years ago. I said, wait a second, what a great bike corridor that would be. Little did I know they were already onto this idea of doing the underline. So as we speak, there's an underline Conservancy, which is developing a linear park and greenway for 10 miles underneath this elevated transit line. So again, you think you have no room in a place like Miami to make linear parks, and yet you do when you start to look at your underperforming assets. Anybody recognize this? So in my talks around the country, this is sort of like one of my poster children for adaptive infrastructure, multifunctional infrastructure. We had our own little problem not a little problem, it was a big problem in New York with Superstorm Sandy, where we had $20 billion worth of damage and 50 people died. And we understood whether you call it climate change or not, you have to be better prepared for major weather events. You had your 2010 flooding here. And this is, you could have built just a big levee, but you didn't. You built a beautiful multifunctional park with all of those assets, the performing arts and everything else, beautiful gardens. And this Hawkins Partners project is considered to be, there was a great write-up in the Landscape Architecture magazine. This is a great example of that multifunctional infrastructure, green infrastructure, defending against riparian flooding, but also being able to process on site some of the stormwater runoff and have a beautiful park. So whether you like it or not, you have world-class landscape architecture happening in this city. So instead of having 100 people move here, we're going to have 200 now. This is at a very, very different scale, multifunctional infrastructure. The city of Los Angeles has 900 miles of alleys running through it. You know, when you watch those movies like The Terminator, there's always a car chase through some decrepit alley, and they all look kind of like this and this. And they tend to be low albedo, black asphalt. They get really hot. They send this, when it rains, the water goes off into the storm sewers, into the LA River. Instead of going into the ground where they so badly need it, it's going right out into the ocean. So the Trust for Public Land, working with UCLA, University of Arizona, and the city of Los Angeles, came up with a prototype for taking an alley and putting in a water collection system in it, what we call green infrastructure, that goes down to the water table 60 feet below. High albedo, meaning a light-colored surface, so it reflects the sunlight. It doesn't get hot. It stays cooler. And then, as you can see, we can't exactly plant trees in these alleys. So planting's going up the sides of the walls, and then we plant a bunch of trees around the neighborhood. This is a pilot, but you could do 900 miles of these alleys, collect your stormwater, make the city cooler, and also look at the difference. You might even ride a bicycle between here and your school if it feels safe and looks safe in the school. Parks and Public Health. You could go to our website, and this is it's kind of primitive. It's a PDF, but we have this great study, 8 ways that parks improve your health. I cited that fact that so many ways that parks improve your health and mental health. One of the really tiny, literally tiny, and small investments you can make in these things called fitness zones. They're basically an outdoor gym. So you look at your underserved communities where you have the poor health outcomes, the heart disease, the diabetes, obesity, and you start to provide these very sturdy outdoor gyms. The beauty of them is that even a really big one is no bigger than maybe 1/10 of an acre and no more expensive than max $100,000. There's nothing you can do in the world for $100,000, particularly in a park. And these outdoor gyms, free outdoor gyms, which help improve public health, are just that much. And then the whole idea of creative placemaking, how this, by the way, is anybody know Gas Tanks Park in Seattle? One of the most innovative parks ever done, an old gas works, where instead of tearing it down, they were incorporated into, and the hills were artificially created, and you have this terrific view. But this is an arts festival within this complex of a creatively designed space, and another way to engage the population is through what we call creative placemaking. Have them participate in the design of the space, but also make sure that there's ongoing temporary works of art and things going on. So how do you pay for all this stuff? If you have a really strong tax base and your political leaders are savvy enough, you say we're going to fund it out of our tax base, out of our tax levy, and we'll issue bonds for capital construction. But it's not that simple. I'm going to walk you through some of the ways this happens. And some of it is through public funding sources. Some of it is through things like developer exactions. We're very interested now in the concept of tax increment financing, whereby a city will pay money up front, knowing that this development, this new park, whatever it is you do, will create private development that increases your tax base and pays back your upfront investment. Business improvement districts can incorporate parks. So there are many, many different kinds of financing that are not traditional. There are the more traditional financing mechanisms, such as tax measures. In some cities, some counties, the citizens vote to create what they call a park district, and everybody pays a little bit of extra tax to have better park maintenance. Cities can take the money that's earned in parks through revenues, through special events, through golf courses and restaurants and cafes, parking, and give that back to the Parks Department and let that help pay for what the Parks Department does. The sad part is that for people like me and Tommy Lynch is we spend most of our careers begging for the crumbs that fall off the city budget table, and we finally realized there's other people's money is out there, and we can start to bring it in. So your stormwater money, let's keep the concession revenue, whatever it is, but you realize that your investment in parks is really negligible compared to the return on investment from better property value. So here's another way, which is to enter into partnerships with private groups. And this represents a spectrum of public-private partnerships. From on your far right, the left of the screen where I'm standing, is you have contributing friends groups, so like a friends of group, which will typically, there's no formal agreement. They might raise money for different kinds of things. It's voluntary. And that's been the traditional model in cities for a long time. And then as you start to move across to operating friends groups, where there might be individual operating agreements for facilities such as Branchbrook Park, Rittenhouse Square in Philadelphia. In the middle, you have sort of a hybrid joint operation where Madison Square Park or Prospect Park in New York City, Friends of Public Gardens in Boston, where there might be a legal agreement with the city. And they raise money philanthropically and sometimes take on some operations. And then you have private management. Some parks are completely privately managed by nonprofits. The largest example, and perhaps the most venerable, is Central Park. Those of you who have been to, how many people have been to Central Park? So even more than the Highland, that's pretty good. You wouldn't know necessarily as you walk around that now beautiful park that was once a terrible mess, that it's run by a nonprofit group, completely run by a nonprofit group. They receive some funding from the city, but they also raise about $25 or $30 million a year in charitable contributions to run the park. And then you get something that's almost pure privatization with a business improvement district where there's a long-term lease or contract. And that would apply to the place in Boston, Post Office Square, Clyde Warren Park in Dallas, which was built on top of a freeway, Military Park in Newark, where there's no public funds at all going into that park, but they run the park almost exclusively based on earned revenue that stays in the park. So that's a very interesting model. I'm not advocating for any of these models, but just showing you that there's a wide spectrum of models. And I would say that the successful, thank you. One of the characteristics of successful arrangements would be that there's some kind of an operating agreement that holds both sides responsible for meeting in the middle and having a more effective way to operate, so that way things aren't left unsaid. When I was working at New York City Parks Department, again, we had this is a different kind of spectrum, where we had public sector managements, and I'd call that public-public. So there are parks like Hudson River Park and Brooklyn Bridge Park was city and state, or you could have city and county, you could have city and federal, and those are important. Then private sector partnerships where services normally done by the city might be done by a private sector partner, by a business partner. So one of the things we did in New York was we had 13 golf courses, and we were doing a terrible job running them and losing money. So they looked bad and they lost money. That was not a good thing. And a long ago park commissioner named Gordon Davis said, "What are we doing in the golf business? Let's find golf course operators to do this." And we did. They invested their own capital in fixing them up. They run them, they collect the fees and pay the city rent. So we went from a net loss of $2 million with terrible courses to a net gain of $8 million with good courses. Now it doesn't always work that well, but that was such a win. The public access agreements, corporate sponsorships, Adopt a Park. The public access agreements, in some cases you can get parks built by developers when they're getting some kind of a zoning bonus, or when in some cities they have developers along waterfronts are required to build public access parks at their expense and pay to maintain them. And if you have enough economic activity, you can require that of developers, and then you have your nonprofit partnerships, including those with operating agreements. So the first really big one was in Central Park, and you can see in this diagram how it's a partnership. You've got the public represented by the Parks Commissioner, at one point that was me, the private represented by the Board of Trustees of the Conservancy. They meet in the middle where the Central Park Administrator, which is sort of a city position, reports to the Parks Commissioner, but also reports to the Board of Directors, the Board of Trustees. And the city sets the policy, they decide on the special events, they enforce the rules and regulations, they do the security, but the Central Park Conservancy does everything else. And again, that's not a model that can be easily replicated, but it's just turned out to be a good model. That Conservancy arrangement spawned similar arrangements around the country. This is Piedmont Park, which is the big park in Atlanta, Georgia. And if you look at this, these are the before pictures. So take a good look at them, because these are the very same areas after the Piedmont Park Conservancy got involved. So we'll go back. So that whole, hidden in there is an arbor, all covered with kudzu. There's the abandoned swimming complex. There's this area which is also abandoned, and they're using the center of the park for parking. And then the Piedmont Conservancy gets involved, and you have this kind of a transformation. And it really is the Central Park of Atlanta. Here's another transformation. Anybody know where this is? Downtown Chicago, right? Giant subterranean parking lot, train tracks, and a very undistinguished sort of Beaux-Arts city space with nobody in it, right? And nothing going on downtown. And then there's this, Millennium Park. So this, if you're the mayor, which would you rather have? What's drawing in the tourists and the business and the real estate developers and the hotels? And so parks as tourism boosters is a really interesting concept. And if you doubt that, just look at this. You just go to Millennium Park on any day, and there's the new Pritzker Pavilion. And then just beyond that now is Maggie Daley Park, a spectacular park designed by Michael Van Valkenburg. This was a $500 million project. Again, a lot of money, but 250 million of it was privately raised, and the city put in the balance. And I'm willing to bet that the math is the same in terms of the amortization from the surrounding property owners and the net new taxes, not to mention, tourists come to see a park and to see not just the park, but the artwork in it. Houston is a great park city. They recently decided that they like this idea of the 10-minute walk, and so they've adopted within their general plan for the city that they're going to go from the current access, which is about 45% of Houston residents have a park with a 10-minute walk. They're going to officially move to having 70% having access by the year 2040. Now, the Hermann Park Conservancy will not improve the access, but look at the improvements they've made in the park. So again, these are all before and after. The before is on the left, after on the right. Pittsburgh. So the point here is that these are cities that are not necessarily wealthy cities. They're not New York. They're not cities that, particularly Houston, that are pedestrian-oriented or have great mass transit. They're very car-oriented. But look at the changes they've been able to go there. And then not too far from here, the biggest private park development project in the country is the parklands of Floyd's Fork 21st Century Parks, which is in Louisville, outside of Louisville. They're developing a 4,000-acre park, primarily with private money, but also with public money, but being done through a nonprofit conservancy, which is running the project and managing the park. And it's just spectacular. And Louisville is a city similar to this, where they absorbed surrounding suburbs in the 1970s, and those suburbs didn't really they hadn't planned for parks the way the central core. The central core of Louisville has spectacular Olmsted parks. It's got more Olmsted parks than New York City. But as they expanded dramatically and absorbed the nearby suburbs, there was no planning done for the park. So this is sort of retroactive planning, and they were able to grab a lot of open space before it got developed. So now to talk about park systems. And they don't have to be big signature parks. The preview of my talk, they talk about the so-called big sexy parks. There's not necessarily anything sexy about a community garden, but that's a type of a park. It's a small neighborhood oasis. It's giving you the ecosystem services. It's really building community. And for these refugees, it's their first exposure to democracy. And you know that the underpinnings of the creation of Central Park was that it'd be a democratic public space, that the different economic classes would mix, and we'd have a better democracy and a better society. And these community gardens are in many cases the beginnings of democracy for new immigrants. In New York City, there are 600 community gardens. And part of that started when, believe it or not, New York City property was sitting vacant and undeveloped. And owners were not paying taxes on them, so the city seized them. They were called in-rem properties. And they allowed temporary gardens to go in them while they waited for them to have developer interest. Well, guess what happened? people came in and did the community gardens, and when the city wanted to sell them for development, once the real estate market turned around, they said, we don't want to do that. We know we promised we would get out, we're not getting out. So they sued, and the settlement of the lawsuit was that the city decided to keep 300 gardens. And so there are now a total of 600 gardens in New York City, and they're crucial to quality of life to so many neighborhoods. Here's another really interesting tactic. Again, for crowded cities that say, we don't have room for new parks, we're not going to use eminent domain to condemn property and build new parks, we can't afford to do it, and we have no open land. And then you start to look at, okay, what are the underperforming assets? In New York City, there are 1,000 schools, 1,000 public schools, 1.1 million students. Each school has what they euphemistically call a schoolyard. I call it a prison yard. It's that. This is a schoolyard. It's a big sheet of asphalt surrounded by a sort of concentration camp style fence. It's very charming. If you're running and you fall down, you're going to be bleeding. And best of all, in neighborhoods that lack playgrounds, they're locked up all weekend long and all summer long and on holiday centers. So we came up with a radical idea. That is, we, the Trust for Public Land, we were going school by school and saying, if you let us fix up your playgrounds, the quid pro quo is you'll open it to the community after school every day at 3 o'clock and weekends and summers. And we were doing that school by school, and then Mayor Bloomberg, doing New York City's own plan, similar to what you've done here in Nashville, said, I want to increase the 10-minute walk factor dramatically. So we took 300 schoolyards and virtually overnight did some capital rehab on them, transformed them into community playgrounds. And so every city in America has something similar. There are school playgrounds, school ball fields, schoolyards that, in many cases, it's a separate board of education or something that they don't want the trouble to come in, the troublemakers, so they lock them up on weekends. But this is the low-hanging fruit. The latest example in New York is we were able to get our hands on some of the green infrastructure money. New York is a city with big sewage problems. We're dumping a lot of raw sewage every time it rains into the harbor. So there's a big incentive to capture that stormwater and put it underground. So we said, what if we design our parks with a big sponge-like artificial turf field in the middle, and rain gardens at the low end where the drainage happens, and green roofs and pavilions and lots of trees, and transform this schoolyard into that. And so that's the newest mode that the Trust for Public Land is doing, where we combine public and private funds and make a beautiful new schoolyard for the school, but a great new community playground. And I was in one of those playgrounds the other day. It was a weekend. There were 200 people in a half-acre or 1-acre playground. And I was talking to a mother. She said, this is our quad. We like this better than the parks. So this is an interesting model for, again, cities that say we don't have the room to expand or to enhance that 10-minute walk, but start to look at your underutilized assets. So that's what they're doing in Houston, what they call it the Smart School Park Program. So the linchpin of their program of increasing the number of parks with a 10-minute walk is through smart parks. And we actually have a Trust for Public Land staff person embedded in the Houston Parks Department just to help dramatically expand this program. And then in San Francisco, this was an existing park in the Tenderloin. Has anybody been to the Tenderloin, San Francisco? Charming neighborhood. Any drug you want to buy, you can buy there. And you can consume it on premises and reel around the streets. It's a tough neighborhood. And there was a terrible park there, and we got involved with San Francisco Rec and Parks and turned this Needle Park, a terrible junkie park, into a really nice playground. It's got a little grass lawn, a LEED certified community center, beautiful playground, basketball courts, and around the corner it goes up to the next street with a garden and sitting area. And we worked very closely with the citizens. So again, it's not just what you do with your parks, it's how you do it. So this level of community engagement, and we have a community-based organization now in there which is programming the site. So it's no longer overrun by drug dealers and their customers. Not one of our projects, but one of the great adaptive reuses around the country. This is Railroad Park, a former rail yard in Birmingham, Alabama. So again, we're talking different scale of city, which has become the social centerpiece of Birmingham, Alabama for events, for walking, for running, for playgrounds, great concert series. One of the poorest cities in the whole country, Newark, New Jersey. There's Newark, downtown Newark. It's come back very nicely. This is the Passaic River. Do not go in that water. It is a federal EPA Superfund site. And this piece of land here on the left used to be a paint factory. It was a brownfield, heavily polluted. And the reason why the river is polluted is because there was a Union Carbide factory on the edge of it that was dumping the residue from producing Agent Orange into the river. It's nasty stuff, yeah. However, that's done. The cleanup has been commenced through the Superfund, and because we enjoy easy projects, that is a brownfield at the edge of a Superfund site, we came in and built the first waterfront access park in downtown Newark. So for 100 years, the residents of Newark did not have access to their waterfront, and now suddenly they do. We've got a little floating dock there so you can do kayaking, canoe. It's okay to kayak and canoe. I mean, you wouldn't want to drink the water or swim in it, but it's okay to use. So again, just because a city is poor doesn't mean it can't have waterfront access. And the whole issue, first and foremost on our docket, is equity. That we focus on parks, communities that lack parks, communities that lack quality parks, communities of high poverty and inequity. And look at this transformation. This picture really says it all. And again, it doesn't have to be a big city. This is Green Bay, Wisconsin. Stoss Landscape. Chris Reed, great landscape architect, has come along and created this beautiful, elegant, very simple waterfront all along the Fox River. And something about rail yards, you know, as unfortunately as the rail industry has gone away, they've left behind often toxic remnant areas. And this is in Santa Fe, New Mexico. This happens to be a Trust for Public Land project, a really, really beautiful new park, so a poor asset, an underperforming asset, this underused rail yard, converted into a new park in downtown Santa Fe. And then this is just the beginning of a massive new project right next to downtown Los Angeles. There is a big state park being created. Not one of our projects. We had we're not building it, but we had something to do with some of the land acquisition. But another example of when you think that there isn't room to do a park, and again, you look at LA, if you've ever flown into LA, you fly in and you look around and say, where's the green? You know, there's a golf course, there's a cemetery, there's another cemetery, but where are the parks? LA is very poorly served by parks, so we're now thinking about, in addition to things like this, there's a lot of big churches in LA. The old Forum, remember where the Lakers used to play, is now a church. It's got parking for 18,000 LA Laker fans. They don't need that parking anymore. So we're thinking about parking lots as parks. Could we get easements from the churches and create small parks, or maybe big parks in the parking lots? And Rick, do you want to say a word about this? Pretty great city, not as great as Nashville, but a pretty great city. And you've got the Nissan plant outside here, but one of the reasons the Volkswagen plant set up business there was because they said, this is a city with great parks. And this was before we got involved with the city to build the Tennessee River Walk, which is it's more than just a walk. You can ride your bicycle. We had to do a lot of complicated land transfers and land acquisitions. We had to build some bridges. Some of the path has to be designed to take a flooding because the water level goes up and down depending on the dams on the Tennessee River. But talk about connective tissue in the community. This is really pulling together all the neighborhoods of Chattanooga in one of the nicest waterfront greenways I've ever seen. And I call this son of Highline or daughter of Highline. Chicago had a 3.5 mile, actually 2.7 mile elevated freight rail line no longer being used in the Bucktown Wicker Park neighborhood. It's just sort of north central Chicago, runs kind of east-west. And that was what it looked like, running behind all these, some abandoned, but some newly established residential buildings, and this brave woman is out running in this abandoned rail line in the old days. And then first Mayor Daley, Richard Daley Jr., and then later Mayor Emanuel decided it was also a good idea. They got behind this, and this is the groundbreaking for what they call, originally known as the Bloomingdale Trail, because it was the Bloomingdale line. Later, for some reason, we gave it the hipster name 606. I think it's the Chicago area code. I prefer Bloomingdale Trail, but that's, and here it is today. It opened about a year ago, and on the first day, 50,000 people came out on it. It's very narrow, as you can see. So it's for use primarily cyclists in the middle, and there's these blue rubberized running tracks on each side. and then different kinds of environmental conditions on each side. Again, this is the work of Michael van Valkenburg, who I view as the Olmsted of this century. And it goes through some of the industrial areas, but increasingly through residential areas. Very diverse, heavily Latino community, but it creates, again, this connective tissue and really, really good, safe bicycling in a city, which is otherwise not that great for bicycling. And I used to think that there was big money being spent by private donors in New York City, and there is, but the biggest privately funded park with pure private funding is in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And again, Michael van Valkenburg. This is not a commercial for Michael van Valkenburg. He just gets a lot of good jobs. These are renderings of what is being built now. It's a 150-acre, I think it's a 150-acre park along the river in downtown Tulsa, being paid for with a $350 million donation from the George Kaiser Family Foundation, where I think it's a $200 million donation. They're raising the other 150. There's a little tiny piece of public money in it, but it's this kind of philanthropy is extraordinary. That, by any measure, $350 million to build a new park is extraordinary. Don't try this at home, folks. This is once in a lifetime. But I give this as an example to you. It's not New York, it's not Boston, it's not San Francisco, it's not Silicon Valley, it's Tulsa. And this is a family that made a lot of money in oil and gas and then later in banking and gave something back in a major way. So I also say this by way of an inspirational example that, and this is a bolt of lightning. I don't expect this to happen in every city, but it can happen. I still say that the major responsibility falls on the shoulders of the city, the mayor, the city council, and the taxpayers to say we're going to pay a little bit of extra tax to pay for the bonds, the interest on the bonds, to build these things. We know that city parks are always underfunded when it comes to maintenance, and we should figure out ways to let them keep their revenue or find revenue enhancements, developer exactions, whatever it might be. So in a growing city like this one, as I look at places like the Gulch, I'm thinking, okay, where are the green spaces? With these suddenly growing communities, let's plan for the green spaces, and you are planning for them. But how will you pay to keep them up? Those are some of the challenges. So that ends the show. I will tell you that if you are interested in more detail, this is the commercial plug. You can find on our website some more publications if you're interested in the whole idea of parks as green infrastructure, using water, sewer money, and water collection money to make parks. We've got this report called City Parks with Clean Water, Making Great Places to Use Green Infrastructure. That's available for free download on our website. We publish an almanac called City Park Facts. You can go online and find our park score and see where Nashville stands in park score. And then, particularly for interest in public-private partnerships, we've got a report called Public Spaces, Private Money, the Triumphs and Pitfalls of Urban Park Conservancies, where we kind of lay out what makes for a good public-private partnership. So that's just a little plug for some of our fact-finding through something called the City Park Center for City Parks Excellence, which is our very, very tiny think tank in Washington. When I say tiny, it's either 1.5 or 2.5 people, depending on how our budget's doing. So that concludes my formal remarks, and to the extent we have time, I'd be happy to take some questions. So thank you very much.